Welcome back to another episode of Hold Fast, where we have biblical truths for daily battles. My name is Kenny. I am the host of the podcast, and today I want to talk about a subject that actually came up in my own mind and study. One of the things that you may find interesting, or you may not. If you don't, I'm sorry. But whenever I'm preparing a sermon, one of the hardest things to do in sermon prep is to figure out what not to say. Because when I take a passage of the Bible and I try to study it, and I spend hours, poring over that text and reading commentaries and listening to sermons and all that, so much stuff, so much content fills my mind. And then when I sit down to actually write the sermon, in order to not preach for 2 hours, I have to figure out, okay, what do I actually put in and what do I leave out? And the what do I leave out is sometimes the hardest part, because it all seems important, right? It all seems like things that I would want to talk about in a sermon. And so today's episode birthed out of some of that content. So as of the day that I'm recording this coming Sunday, from the day of recording, I'm going to preach from Matthew chapter 4, verses 23 through 25. Once you listen to this podcast, that sermon will be available on MissionWay Church Sermons. If you search MissionWay Church Sermons, you want to hear the full sermon, you are welcome to do that on any podcasting platform. You can go to our website or our YouTube page and watch that as well. But as I was reading through this passage, there's a lot that I want to talk about on Sunday, but there was this thought that occurred to me that I saw in my study that I'm not going to really have time to get into on Sunday, so I wanted to take a minute to do that on the podcast. And it's the thought that comes when we read in Matthew chapter 4, verses 23 through 25, that these large crowds were following after Jesus. Now, this isn't the only place we see that. All throughout Jesus' ministry, we see large crowds gathering around him, right? And there were so many miracles that he performed in front of these crowds, and there was so much teaching that he did to the crowds, and they literally would follow him everywhere. There was one instance, I believe, when Jesus was healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law, when literally the crowds were like pressed in at the door of this house. Like there was potentially thousands of people outside of the door of this house waiting on Jesus. Like, when is he going to come out? We're ready for him to perform more miracles. And one of the statements that Matthew makes in Matthew 4:24 is that his fame spread throughout all Syria. And they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And verse 25 says, and great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. So it wasn't just Jerusalem. It wasn't just the Jews that were hearing about Jesus. It was the Gentiles and the heathens in places like Syria. It was all of these people from all of these surrounding towns. There were thousands upon thousands of people that were following him. I mean, we see stories like when Jesus fed the 5,000, that was just 5,000 men. If you count women and children, it was a conservative number is 10,000 people in that one instance, right? And so Jesus often was followed by really large crowds of people. And I think it's important for us to talk about this for many reasons, but one of them was brought out by a guy named H.D.M. Spence, who wrote a commentary called the Pulpit Commentary, which I would highly recommend if you like to find good commentaries. It's a little bit older. Sometimes you have to be a little bit slower to read it, but it's really, really good. H.D.M. Spence said this, talking about all these great crowds following Jesus. He says, the disciples of the Lord must not trust in popular applause. They may have it, it comes sometimes, but it's uncertain. It's fickle. It's not to be relied on. We must do our duty looking simply to Jesus, not to human praise. Now, I thought this was really timely in the day and age in which we live, because, and we talk about this pretty often, more and more and more, it seems like society is coming against Christianity, and we're getting less and less of the approval of the culture. Now, that's true in one sense, and in another sense, it's not, because you have this side of people who are against Christianity and the things that we stand for, but then you have a lot of people who have certain political leanings that agree with some of the things that Christians are saying, right? And so they agree with us, and we get some of their, if I can use the word, favor and applause, right? Because they agree with some of the things that we're saying, so they kind of jump on our team for a little bit, and it can be really easy to want that, right? And I'm not saying it's a bad thing when people agree with us if we're speaking truth. That's a good thing. But if that's what we're seeking for, what we're going to begin to chase is the applause of men, not the approval of God. And so we see this often when a Christian ends up on some television show or interview where they're being asked to defend Christian values. It often happens that the Christian is ridiculed, but the person speaking against Christianity is applauded. This happens so often, and we see it more and more and more. And so on the one hand, we cannot allow those times to discourage us because we're not seeking the approval of man, we're seeking the approval of God. And on the other hand, we can't allow the times when somehow the world happens to applaud us and to agree with us, we can't allow those times to bear too much weight on our hearts either, because then we begin to chase after human approval and human applause. And Paul was very strong in the fact that I'm not seeking to please men. I'm seeking to please the Lord. It doesn't mean that I don't care at all what people think and, I'm just going to do whatever I can to offend them. It means that I don't find my worth and my identity. I don't determine what's true and what I'm going to speak up about based on the culture around me and whether or not they agree with me and they're applauding me. And you go, well, how does this apply to Jesus? It absolutely applies to Jesus, because these great crowds continued to follow Jesus and Jesus continued to preach the gospel. Right? And so we see instances, one of the most famous is in John chapter 6, when he's talking about the fact that if you want to follow after me, you gotta eat my flesh and drink my blood, right? And obviously we know Jesus wasn't literally saying that we need to feed on him in that way, in a literal way. We know it's in a spiritual sense, but the crowds couldn't hear that. And when they asked Jesus for clarification, he just said it again. He went even more strongly in his language, right? Because he wasn't seeking to earn their approval, and many of them walked away. And best we can tell, these thousands of people walked away. He had just fed that crowd of 10,000 plus people. They followed him here. He teaches them all these things, and 10,000 people roughly walked away from Jesus in a moment. And it seems like all that was left was the 12 disciples, and that's when we have that famous statement from Peter, right? Lord, where are we going to go? Because you have the words of eternal life. So the disciples recognized that Jesus pushed away the crowds with truth, but the disciples weren't about to seek to be people pleasers. They wanted to please the Lord, who they now were following. And so they go, Lord, you have the words of eternal life, and we know that you're the Son of God, so we're not going to go after the crowds. We're not going to go after the popular opinion. We may not understand everything that you're saying. We may not like everything that you're saying, but we're going to hold fast to your truth. We're not going to be tossed to and fro by every wind and wave of the culture. Now, think about the crowds that followed Jesus. There was a point in his ministry where Mark says that Jesus couldn't openly enter a town anymore. Because if Jesus just waltzed into a town and made it obvious that he was coming into a town, there would be such large crowds that it was too much. It was overbearing. All this popularity because he's performing miracles, and it would have been, in our human tendencies, it would be so easy to look at that and go, Jesus, why didn't you capitalize on that, right? Like, why didn't you soften your speech a little bit so that you could keep these crowds? Because maybe if you keep them around long enough, maybe one day they'll want to know the truth. Like, why didn't you just keep performing miracles and doing all the things that was drawing the crowds? Don't preach something that's false, but just go a little bit easier on the hard truths, Jesus, so that you can keep these crowds, and maybe one day they'll follow after you, and then you can go into the hard truths, right? That's often our strategy of evangelism. We want the world to like us so that we can witness to them. The problem with that is, in order for the world to not hate us, we've got to be silent about truth. Now, I'm not saying that we should strive for the world to hate us. We should love our neighbors. We should do, as far as we are able to, live quiet and peaceable lives. The scriptures are clear about that. However, we are not to be silent about the truth. We're not to shy away from speaking and living in such a way that would cause the world to hate us. Instead, we should expect that the world's going to hate us. We should expect that maybe there'll be times like Jesus where we're popular and people agree with us, but there's probably going to be far more occurrences of the world hating us like they did Jesus, because all these large crowds followed him, but they were also the crowds that eventually said, crucify him. They were the crowds that wanted what he could do for them, but when he started to preach truth, when he started to talk about what it actually meant to follow after him, they wanted nothing to do with that. And the same is true in our world and in our culture today. And we've always been at this crossroads, I think, in Christianity, but it seems really obvious and prevalent now. We're at a crossroads. Are we going to chase after the ideologies of the world in order that the world would like us and that we could earn some sort of street cred with the people of the world in our churches? Or are we going to be willing to stand on the truth of the gospel? Are we going to be willing to see the great crowds and love them and have compassion on them like Jesus did and serve them like Jesus did, but also preach truth to them? Because in that same passage in Matthew, again, that I'm going to preach on this coming Sunday, it says he was going throughout Galilee, and yes, he was healing, but first Matthew says he was teaching in their synagogues and he was proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. And at first, the people didn't really mind it that much, maybe, because he was performing miracles, he was healing their sick, and they thought, there's got to be something here. But as Jesus continued to preach the gospel, eventually they all walked away, or many of them walked away. Many of them also followed him, don't get me wrong, but many of them walked away. Many of them hated him. They were the ones that shouted, "Crucify him," in the end. And Jesus set the example for us on how we should react when we have the opportunity to gain the approval of men. Are we seeking to be popular? Are we seeking to be well-liked? Are we seeking to even be respected by the world? Or are we seeking to live for God's approval, not men's? That's a pretty standard question. I don't think I'm sharing anything here that's like mind-blowing or this big revelation for anybody. But I see the tendency in myself far too often, and I see the tendency in so many Christians far too often that we just don't want to offend. We don't want to rock the boat. We want to build relationships, which is a good thing, and we want to serve people, which is a good thing. Keep doing those things. But we do that so much that we wait until this perfect opportunity where I can finally share the gospel and maybe they won't hate me. But the truth is, the gospel will always be offensive. You will never earn enough respect and deepen your relationship enough with somebody that the gospel will not offend them, because it offends sinners, and we're all sinners. We were all offended by the gospel before we believed in the gospel, right? And I'm not saying offend them for the sake of offending them. I'm saying be willing to love them enough to preach truth to them while you're serving them, while you are being kind to them, while you're loving them as you would love yourself, love your neighbor as you love yourself. All of those things are true. But love God above everything else. Seek his approval above everything else. Proclaim his truth even when it's unpopular to do so. And I think that fear of losing approval with the world has caused Christians to either be silent on many subjects or soften our approach on many subjects. And it's led to, I've seen pastors and churches begin to soft pedal certain issues that the Bible teaches clearly on, and then they start out with this issue and then they go to the next, and eventually they begin to abandon the faith altogether. Now, I'm not saying that everybody that's walked away from Christianity, they've walked away because they wanted to be popular with the world. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying I've seen that. I've seen people who begin to just say, listen, I don't want to be too offensive. I don't want the world to hate me. I want them to like me so that I can give them the gospel. I think in many cases the motives start off right, but eventually as they continue to seek the approval of men, they become silent about God's truth. And then one day, in a lot of cases, they end up rejecting God's truth entirely. Not just being silent about it, not just not wanting to offend, but saying, you know what, I agree with the world on this. And they walk away from the faith. And I don't want that to be me. I don't want that to be any of you listening to this. And I hope you don't hear me just preaching this message of saying, just don't care what the world thinks and just be a jerk and preach truth. Even if you offend people, just keep screaming it in their faces. That's not what I'm saying at all. Be kind and tenderhearted. Correct your opponents with gentleness. There's even instances where Jesus says if they reject your message, just walk away. Shake the dust off your feet and walk away. There's times even when that can be appropriate. But let us not shy away from the truth for the sake of gaining popularity, for the sake of gaining status and approval of the people around us. Jesus didn't. All the great crowds that followed him, he continued to have compassion on them. He continued to serve them. But there came a day when they did not want to listen to his truth. There came a day when they rejected him and they walked away. Jesus didn't change his message. He didn't change his approach. As a matter of fact, you can make the case that as he went further into his ministry, he became even more bold in the things that he was saying and calling out the Pharisees and calling out the Jews of his day, because he sought the approval of his Father, not the approval of men. May we do the same. I hope that this is, as always, encouraging, thought-provoking. I hope that you listen to these episodes and you evaluate your own life and ask, how is it that I'm seeking the approval of men? Like in what areas of my life am I shying away from the truth, shying away from my calling to go and make disciples because I want the approval of men? In what ways am I doing that, and how can I repent from that and begin to be bold in love and with gentleness, but with boldness and with the truth, always on my lips, always in my actions, so that I can win more people for the sake of the gospel. So thanks for listening as always. I pray that this is an episode that you find worth sharing with those close to you, maybe sharing on Facebook, social media, giving us a review or rating wherever you're listening to this podcast is helpful. I do want to point out, this is just a side note, and if you're not interested in what I'm about to say, that's okay. This doesn't really relate to what I've talked about. It's just kind of an announcement, generally speaking, for the podcast. But if you do give us ratings, I've noticed on the podcast that there is somebody continues to change their rating, and I think there's a misunderstanding with thinking that you need to rate each episode individually. Just understand that once you give a rating, that's the rating that you need to give for the podcast. You don't have to do it multiple times. It won't give more ratings for me. That it just still counts as one, if that makes sense. So I'm just pointing that out because it's something that I've noticed that it's fluctuated back and forth a little bit. Whatever rating you want to give, that's fine. I'm not trying to tell you what to put in there. I'm just telling you that it won't add to the ratings that are given. I appreciate you all taking the time to do that, but I just wanted to give that point of clarification. But those ratings and reviews do help other people who would not see or hear the podcast, see and hear it. So if you've never done that and you listen to this, I've only got a few ratings compared to the listeners that I have. I would greatly appreciate you just taking a quick moment just to do that. Wherever you listen to this, give a rating, and better yet, give a review, because in the algorithms and how things work, it will put this in front of more people in that way. So thanks again for listening. This has been another episode of Hold Fast. I will be back next week, Lord willing, with another episode. God bless.